1930s, limitations were put on the distribution of land to colonists in order to cope with overproduction in the global coffee sector and hence falling prices. However, as a consequence of the legal status of Rwanda and Burundi, limitations here were not an option, and as such, the Mandate administration stopped the coffee campaigns, but it did not limit small-scale production as such. It can be no surprise that the ways labor entered coffee production differed greatly between plantations and small-scale agriculture. In the plantation sector, labor entered either voluntarily, which increased especially after the Second World War, but in most cases workers were forced to enter, whether by African chiefs or their heavies, or by the colonial state itself. In the smallholder sectors, intermediaries, chiefs, and sub-chiefs were equally important in the coffee sector. During the first coffee campaigns in the early 1930s, those notables functioned as some kind of teachers. They used customary labor systems to instruct people. And after those initial campaigns, notables remained important because they had to control almost every step in the production process of small-scale producers. But there is yet another big difference between east and west of Lake Kivu in the way that colonial administrations transplanted labor from densely populated Rwanda to the Congolese Kivu in an attempt to provide coffee plantations there with sufficient labor, and more in general to try and stop over-recruitments in the colony. All right, once labor is mobilized, one of the key issues then is what about payments? Now, a huge similarity between both sides of the lake is that the least that can be said is that underpayment characterized the entire colonial period. Moreover, my research demonstrated that living standards hardly increased. Furthermore, violence and harsh working conditions were also quite common. For example, people were beating up, the whip was used quite frequently, and so on. However, after World War II, it seems that more emphasis was put on the well-being of the worker, for example, by giving them bonuses instead of fines, which in turn resulted in less violence. But the differences were in the way labor was organized and paid. On the Rwandan side of Lake Kivu, African families were responsible for every step in the production process, but this was not the case in the plantation sector, where we see the emergence of quite specialized workers. Furthermore, plantation workers received a wage, whether a day wage, a weekly wage, or piece wages, but those wages were very low, while small-scale producers had to sell the coffee themselves. However, as I already said, the coffee sector around Lake Kivu did not only develop and evolve as a consequence of differences which resulted in dissimilar ways of land and labor mobilization, but also as a consequence of compromises between and feedback of different actors on the ground involved in the coffee sector. In the first place, there was the feedback of and compromises between the African population active in the coffee sectors and the Europeans. Africans did not only resist the de facto imposition of coffee production for the world market, but they also adapted to it. Let me start with resistance. Now, most resistance in this case has to be understood as weapons of the weak, which means everyday small-scale resistance, such as deserting work, migrating to relatively better places, staying away from work, sabotaging the production process, but also, for example, stealing and smuggling of coffee. Secondly, Africans also adapted to coffee production for the world market. They combined capitalist coffee production with subsistence agriculture. They continued to trade as in pre-colonial times, despite changing context. Moreover, Africans usually had different sources of income besides low coffee wages. Now, all these things in turn influence labor recruitments, for example. So what we see here is actually a loop with one thing influencing the other. Feedback and compromise is also clear with regards to land. In the first place, there were there were a lot of discussions between the already mentioned Comité National du Kivu, settlers, the administrations, and Africans, for instance, about the price settlers had to pay for land, or Africans resisting the appropriation of their land, and so all of this influenced the outlook of the coffee sector. Secondly, in Rwanda, coffee land was perhaps even more a result of compromise than in the Eastern Congo Kivu, because small-scale coffee cultivation was based on customary land tenure, although it was modified in the colonial period. Moreover, in some cases in Rwanda, pasture land was being converted into coffee land, thereby also continuing pre-colonial practices, which once again shows that compromises were being made between different actors. Now, as you can see on this picture, there was quite some cattle in Rwanda, so this means that a lot of pasture land could be converted into coffee land. Compromises between Europeans and Africans is especially clear in the reliance on African intermediaries on both sides of Lake Kivu. Chiefs were responsible for the recruitment of labor, but in Rwanda, the first coffee campaigns relied heavily on chiefs who used customary labor systems to initiate and instruct small-scale producers. Moreover, control over labor in the plantation as well as smallholder sector also relied on African intermediaries. However, compromise also manifested itself in quite another way. Administrations restricted labor recruitments in cases where village life was in danger, but from the mid-1930s until the end of World War II, bureaucracies in the Eastern Congo also restricted labor recruitments for the mining sector in order to support the emerging coffee plantation sector. Finally, the way labor was paid also depended on compromises in the sense that, for example, nearly the entire colonial period was characterized by discussions and negotiations between plantation owners and colonial agents. They were debating the level of wages, for example, which settlers obviously wanted to keep as low as possible, but it seems that, for example, with the introduction of minimum wages after the Second World War on both sides of the lake, compromises no longer were made between settlers and administrations, but that rather more focus was put on the African side of the story. Okay, to conclude, what I have demonstrated is that the spread of capitalism does not result in a homogenizing world, but rather in diverse outcomes due to local conditions. To repeat, in this case, these were land availability, existing land tenure systems, and legal distinctions. Moreover, I also showed that the way capitalist sectors develop is also a result of feedback of and compromise between various local actors involved. By using a comparative framework, I was able to clearly outline this for the coffee sector around Lake Kivu. All of this results in a world where difference is still very apparent despite harmonizing tendencies inherent in capitalism. And with those words, I'm going to end my talk. I thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll have a few short video clips, but as they play, I'll just continue talking, so they're just kind of meant to play in the background. Okay, so you guys might notice I wasn't meant to be here. I was teaching until about 11:30 today, so this was really the only panel that I could present on. So today I'm going to talk about snow, ice, baked beans, and lumberjacks. But through these topics, I'm going to challenge current understandings of the development of industrial capitalism in America. So one definition of industrial capitalism is the process whereby muscle, water, and wind power were replaced by fossil fuels as the primary motive power for production, thus increasing the efficiency and scale of economies. My research my research challenges whether that transition was a necessary characteristic of industrialization. And to explore these issues, I used the logging industry of the American Northeast, which remained relatively technologically stagnant from about 1850 to 1950, while remaining competitive in a global market. So, I don't have to explain this to you guys, but my research, relies on the idea that industrial capitalism depended on this nature-society division. But what's considered nature here is different than what you might think. So I'm going to divide the presentation into 3 parts. I'm going to show how these woodsmen use simple machines, hand tools, and muscle power, and cold weather to increase the speed and efficiency of the labor process to reach industrial levels of production. I'll explain the fuel that made this possible, which was easily digestible, calorie-dense food in tremendous, unprecedented quantities. And lastly, I'll explain how this relates to the meaning of industrial capitalism more generally. So this is the setting for the study, which is known as the Northern Forest, a bioregion, not necessarily a state. So by 1850, the geographic frontier in this area was gone. And the forest no longer yielded value easily to workers. By 1870, the industry was cutting smaller, less valuable spruce and second growth pine, which required about just as much work as these big, what were called pumpkin pine, but the value you got wasn't as much. So people were operating on thin margins after about 1870. So the new frontier after the geographic frontier was over was a frontier of logistics, where operators would have to figure out how to get value from logistical processes rather than the land. So geographer Evelyn Stokes did the definitive study of technological change in this region, and she found that there was little encouragement here to experiment with new ideas because most changes required additional capital investment, and in the face of diminishing yields from the forest were rarely warranted. So logging here remained in what Mumford called the eotechnic stage of development, which was characterized by decreasing use of human energy, which wasn't actually always the case, replaced by animal power or simple engines which harnessed natural sources of energy, wind, or moving water. And this remained the case into the 1950s, in some areas even into the 1970s. So a situation like this, where a French-Canadian immigrant worker drawing logs by hand when much of the rest of the economy was becoming mechanized, would be very characteristic of labor in the northern forest. So another way that operators increased the logistical processes was by taking advantage of the cold weather. So this was a very snowy and cold area, and when roads were covered with snow, it allowed these loggers to move heavy products easier, reducing coefficients of friction. It's a pretty simple concept. So with cold weather, horses were able to pull about 5 times as much energy. And some estimates were that these snow roads that loggers built allowed a 1,500-pound load to pass on roads that would typically only hold 500 pounds. But operators went further than just using the snow to increase the logistical efficiency of their operations, but they used ice, which reduced friction even further. And they did that using this device right here. It's called a sprinkler box, which they could fill, was made entirely in the woods. There wasn't patents for these products. They'd fill them with water and then during the night draw them over their roads, creating roads of ice, which again allowed them to increase the efficiency of the logistical process of the operation. Most importantly, though, icing roads allowed what was a winter industry to extend further into the warmer months. So I did in my, and it also allowed loggers to carry these tremendous loads because on ice this was possible. And then in my research, I mapped some weather to show how much further into the spring you could draw on ice roads if you use these methods. And so after logs were drawn on snow or ice roads, they'd be taken to a riverside, and there the power of the water would move them to their final destination, which was the mill. And so notice here the completely wooden made dam, again constructed in the woods with minimal outside materials, and the tremendous power available to loggers with just water. So using this method, 75 to 90% of the logs made it straight through to the boom or collecting area with no interference. And this process was called river driving, and you can even see people doing this into the 1970s. So avoiding truck transport for this. And so once these logs got to stagnant water, they didn't move as easily as they would when there's this torrent of water behind them. So loggers constructed what was called a headworks, where they would collect the logs in booms and then move them using human muscle power only. And they'd be moving millions of board feet using these headworks, and I'll show you what that looked like. So this is a boom collected on a lake. Again, tremendous amount of wood, tremendous weight, and this was the device with a rope and men winding around, pulling the boom of logs to the outlet of the lake that allowed the labor process to remain unmechanized. So observers that watched these workers going round and round on the capstan wrote, "Here is where men make horses of themselves for 8 shillings a day." And this headwork was used in the woods from, there's a patent in about 1836 up until about World War I. So a tremendous long amount of time for such what seems like a primitive method of production. So of course, without relying on mechanization by fossil fuels, the primary fuel here was food and fodder for workers. And these loggers were known to have consumed a tremendous quantity of food doing this physically demanding work. And luckily, we have good records of how much these loggers ate because of a study that was conducted from 1901 to 1903 called the Study of the Food of Maine Lumbermen. And this study found that the diet of these loggers was some of the most robust of all workers in the United States. And so methods in these studies were quantifying how much food the loggers ate, but even were as detailed as collecting and dissecting the feces of these loggers. So very, very detailed study. So as scientists in the late 19th century began to discover that food contained quantifiable amounts of potential energy, they very quickly began to compare food with wood and coal, and these were all, to them, analogous industrial propellants. Wilbur Olin Atwater, professor of chemistry at Wayland University, was the head of these studies, and the USDA did a bunch of these dietary studies around this time and found that the general principle when it came to proper diet was that liberal food, large production, and higher wages go together. To Atwater, humans were only steam engines in breeches. And he even found, erroneously, in his early studies, that human bodies were more efficient in converting the potential energy of fuel, in their case food, into kinetic energy than were steam engines. So he was doing these comparisons. And so if you get into the specifics of the study, they wrote that in regard to protein and energy, this is the highest yet recorded amount of calories and protein for any class of laboring men. These loggers ate 8,140 calories a day, or over 6 pounds of food, which was provided by operators for free in unlimited quantities. Most importantly, the food was, the way it was prepared, was meant to be eaten quickly but still be energy dense, so it was high fat, high carbohydrate. They could eat 3,000 calories in as little as 10 minutes. I have more specifics on the diet, but I'll move on. So for normal diets of around 2,500 calories, a person can produce about 1 horsepower a day. So these loggers were producing about 2.5 if you do a rough calculation. But most importantly, when you look at this dietary study, by the end of the season, the 6 loggers that were followed for the entire season lost 6 pounds while they were eating 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day. So this 6 pounds allowed operators to avoid investing in high capital steam and gas engines. It was part of workers' bodies that became, in the eyes of operators and perhaps even workers themselves, nature, which could be consistently exploited for a profit. And so the implication here is, ice roads, the weather, the power of the cold weather, and the food wage system describes perfectly how and why fossil fuels weren't a requirement for industrialization. Only seeing these different natural objects, including the human body as nature, and then dividing that from society, and then demanding unlimited profits from what you consider cheap nature.